thank you all for being here. It means quite a lot to me to be able to share my experiences and what I've learned most recently in Fukushima and last year in Chernobyl. Just to give you a little bit of background as to how I came at all of this. I've spent 15 years as a management consultant, then switched over to photography. During my time as a management consultant, I worked a lot with socio-economic development in developing countries. And I grew to have a passion for places that were abandoned due to human interference. This led me to Chernobyl last year, where I spent nearly 7 months documenting the 25 years since the accident at the time, and speaking to close to 227 people across survivors, scientists, academics, people who had witnessed the event even from afar. When I was in Chernobyl, 3/11 happened, Fukushima. I didn't know about it at the time. I was in the villages, and when I arrived back in Kyiv, I arrived to an enormous amount of email traffic and questions about my work in Chernobyl. There had been a dying interest in the topic last year, which has revived now over the last 12 months. And I knew at that point that I was going to have to go to Fukushima and start documenting and asking some of the questions as of year one. And that's where I've been the last 3 months. I literally landed 3 days ago here in Cape Town, and I'm fresh off the evacuation zones and the entry zones. There is a photo exhibit down at the Erdmann Gallery on Short Market Street, where you can see the pictures both of Chernobyl and Fukushima. But what I want to talk to you today is more about the interview side and the hard facts that I was pulling out when speaking to city officials in Japan, to academics again, and to first response people. In particular, speaking to the mayors and former mayors of the cities of Minamisoma, Futaba, and Itatemura, speaking to the residents there as well. I was speaking at the conference in Yokohama for a nuclear-free world, and there met with more academics and scientists involved in curtailing the use of nuclear energy in Japan. What came out of those meetings was very interesting, because we could see the progress of what had been done 1 year ago in the emergency response plans right after the triple disaster, and seeing what is going to be different should there ever be the need to have this type of response. In parallel, most of the reactors in Japan have been shut down. So in theory, these plans and these changes to emergency response are going to be hibernated. However, there are morals and stories, lessons to be learned. And I've broken it down into 3 basic components, which is very easy to see. The first is the preparation. What have we learned that we could prepare better about when we live and are close to a nuclear power plant? The second is, when something does go wrong, what is it that can be done better? And this is something that the people in Fukushima have learned very well. And lastly is, after the event, there's a lot of other issues we never really even thought of. And they never go into our budgeting plans, they never go into our social thoughts, but we should be considering them, and I'll go into them in more depth in a few slides. The first thing I want to do, though, is talk about the first responders. It's very easy to make villains the people who have worked, perhaps, in a power plant that has gone wrong, but actually they're the first heroes. They're really out there trying to control the problem. Along with the firemen, along with the emergency responders, such as policemen as well. And I had the honor of meeting Mr. Kenichi in January, and then again in February. He's been working nonstop in emergency response since 3/11. He sees his wife and his children at the most 3 days a week, 1 time a month. And he's been working in the Minamisoma area, which is 60% evacuated. And you can pretty much see in his face there that he's got post-traumatic stress written all over him. He has internal contamination due to radiation, principally because when he was out first in rescue and then in recovery operations, at that point looking for bodies, they didn't have any protective gear. And that is rather appalling, considering the meticulous ability of Japanese society and Japanese infrastructure to plan. I'm going to quickly, I think it's 2 minutes, let me find the cable here, let you hear a Q&A session with him that was held and organized by one of the largest NGOs in Japan called Peaceboat, and that is actually the organization that helped Peter and I meet originally. So let me share this with you.
Her question is, before the Fukushima accident, did you receive as a fireman any training where there might be a potential nuclear accident and what to do in that event?
それはですね、第一原発がある場所というのが双葉地方というところにあります。で、私たちの消防本部があるのは相馬地方ということがあって、2つ、第一原発を管轄している消防本部というのが双葉消防本部で、我々は全く関係がないというか、隣接はしているものの関係ないんですけれども、で、もしそういう事故が起きた場合は、その双葉消防本部の方で、処理をするというふうな協定になっております。
Next door in Futaba, the fire station in Futaba are designated or chosen as the ones who are supposed to be able to take care of any situation that related to Fukushima, and that they were not trained in any way, and that was the agreement made.
The actual site of Fukushima Daiichi is Futaba town and Okuma town. So those people were trained, but no, if you were in local authority outside, you were not trained.
そういう協定になっているものですから、私たちの方では化学防護服というものはあるものの、放射線に対するその防護服というものはありませんでしたので、先ほど言ったように、対抗しうるものがないので、雨がっぱであるとか、あとは消防の火を消すときに使う服、防火服というものを着て、屋外で活動をしておりました。
Because the agreement of the governments that they were not responsible for anything that had to do with radiation or the Fukushima situation, they had no radiation protection gear. There's just the ordinary fire protection and chemical protection gear. So that's why they had to work with only rain gear and their fire protection gear in the radioactive environment.
Indeed, there were fire departments that were trained and did have the safety gear, but given the triple disaster, were in no condition to respond. What this proved was that emergency response teams had to be trained and prepared not only from the immediate area, but from across Japan, and indeed anywhere where we think the spume of radioactive material could land. And in the case of Fukushima Daiichi, it was much more than 20 kilometers or 3 kilometers. It has reached as much as 54 kilometers, particularly in the northwest, from the plant. The original evacuation zone was 3 kilometers. 48 hours later, it was pushed to a 20-kilometer radius as a mandatory radiation evacuation level zone. When the evacuation order came about, it was handled very much by word of mouth. We have to keep in mind that the entire zone had been overcome first by the earthquake and then the tsunami. So that's a formidable obstacle. But nonetheless, there were no redundancy communication systems in place. The evacuation orders in some cases were posted on the bulletin boards of community centers, and neighbors spread the word from house to house. The practice of posting this type of information rather informally throughout the zone, and then in the zone which was a voluntary evacuation zone, which was between kilometer 20 and kilometer 30, continued being posted, as we can see on the left, until January of this year. As of January, thanks to reviews in the modus operandi, many of these areas now have automized radiation meters, which you can now see on your right. And this one in particular, which was in a school ground, is reading 5.29 microsieverts per hour. The opposite side of this field had less than 1 microsievert, so we see an enormous variance even within these areas. The review of the Nuclear Safety Commission of Japan and its subcommittee came to the conclusion that the local governments required more autonomy in the decision-making of when to evacuate and when to determine that there were dangerous levels of radiation in their area. So that was one of the big changes in the evacuation and first response plans. There's a small lesson here also from Chernobyl, which the Japanese authorities reached the same conclusion. That's to leverage the community. You have civil organizations, you have neighbor watch groups, you have PTA organizations even. You can leverage all of these organizations to quickly put out the word in need of an evacuation or of taking of stabilized iodine, whatever it happens to be. The Japanese response, initial response at least, made very poor use of this. In the last year, there's been an excellent development of these grassroots organizations, and the training of these civil groups throughout other areas in Japan where there are nuclear reactors started as early as June of last year. So they've done an enormous amount to become much more prepared in case of a further emergency. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was systematic and pretty much shoved down your throats in school. But you still go to Pripyat today, and you can find evidence of how to train and protect yourself in case of a biohazard or of a nuclear attack. The irony is that none of that was put in place at the time of the accident. The other thing which sounds really basic is, and let me ask you, if something were to happen, how do you think you would learn about it, be it a natural disaster or a man-made disaster? You're in the city streets of Cape Town. How do you think you'd learn about it? What would be the first thing you'd hear? Anybody?
Deafening silence.
Well, the Japanese have a melody for tsunamis and for earthquakes. They didn't have one for nuclear reactors having a leak. Other countries with earthquakes have similar warnings for tsunamis and for earthquakes. The Japanese also have a very sophisticated SMS early warning saying there's been an earthquake in Kendai, we can expect 2 minutes before it will hit Tokyo. So you get an early warning system. That had not been integrated for the nuclear plants. Since then, that system has now been able to be piggybacked, and there's an early warning system. But ironically, the PA systems, which were being used for other purposes, had not been used that day for telling about a leak in Fukushima Daiichi. So neighbors literally were telling each other on the phone where phone lines were working or going house to house. And ironically, what was working the days of the disaster were Twitter and Facebook. And those who had particularly BlackBerry phones were able to use that infrastructure and communicate with each other. So today, those systems have also been upgraded to advise in case of a potential accident. It sounds basic, but it had been overlooked. while I was walking around the sites in Fukushima, I came across many of the notes from the first evacuation in the 3-kilometer and then the 16-kilometer and then in the 20 and 22-kilometer areas. But one of the recommendations that came out of the review of the first response was to say, if we have suspicion of a high leak, we don't go to the first evacuation circle, which is usually about 3 kilometers away from these plants. Automatically push it to 20 kilometers. And that, in some cases, might not even be enough. But in the most likely of cases, it will buy time if we fall back to a 20-kilometer radius. So that was one of the recommendations that came out from the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare in Japan. Within that 20-kilometer perimeter and out to 100 kilometers beyond the zone of accident, there needs to be capable medical response capacity. That means if there's anyone who has suffered from radiation poisoning, they can be attended to very quickly. Triage is set up in that, and there is a redundancy of medical staff and capacity in the perimeter up to 100 kilometers beyond the accident. What has changed also is that local hospitals are stockpiling stabilized iodine. At the time of the accident, some of the hospitals had it but did not issue it because the orders did not come down to the local response headquarters. This was a tie-up of centralized commands, interlinking with TEPCO at the time, a downing of the communication lines because of infrastructure failures, etc. So the solution around this is to have a capillarity. And think of it much like the internet. If you lose one channel, another one continues to be working. So by having this capillarity, you can move forward, and empowering local government officials, they can then make the choice to issue iodine, to issue evacuation orders. And why all of this? Because they now have, as you saw earlier in one of the pictures, the Geiger counters, basically, or radiation measurement devices capable of telling them if there's been a leak. Now, this is what's the big headlines in Japan right now, and this is perhaps what's most overlooked in the analysis of nuclear energy and the consequences of something going wrong. And so saying there's an enormous economic loss, and have we really measured it? We don't have case studies to effectively know how much it's going to cost us as a society. And I'm not even talking in terms of human life and human health. I'm just looking at the economics of it and being very cold about it. But the Japanese economy has definitely suffered as a consequence of the particular, not only the triple disaster, but of having to respond now to the condemned lands, real estate, and claims being put against TEPCO, and which the government is now going to have to absorb as a consequence of the accident. In the last 4 weeks, the government has confirmed that TEPCO will have to pay for the loss of real estate and for personal assets. That can be a long list, from your TV to your microwave to your clothes, which you had to leave behind and which are now contaminated with radiation and you can no longer use. If TEPCO falls short, which they are, and going most likely into bankruptcy, the government will cover the shortcoming. It's still not determined how much that gap is going to be, when it's going to be paid, and how it's going to be paid. There's lots of legal impediments as well as to when that could be paid, because if the two parties agree on 1 point but disagree on 3, the point on which they agree will not be paid out until the other 3 are resolved. So there's now changes in the legislature to make sure that as you move forward on resolving the issues for compensation, you get paid out as soon as possible. The other issue is you have a mortgage that's lasting you 15 to 30 years, and lo and behold, you've lost your house. And you've lost your job, and you don't have unemployment insurance. So what's going to happen? And the banks are asking that question as well. The government, again, is having to see that they're going to have to step in and create some type of bailout package. Many areas are still up in the air, and nonetheless, there's an enormous push by the Dispute Resolution and Compensation committees and organs to have everything covered from psychological stress to nursing. We have to remember that Japan is an aging population, so the issue of nursing and nursing homes is very important to them. And everything going up to the monthly checkups from here to the end of the person's life, and monitoring their properties as well to see if at some point they can come back and pick up their assets or not. Growing litigation. What I heard a lot of from former residents is what we are getting or what we are being offered hardly covers the cost of buying a new house. What is a standard monthly compensation is, I put there 110,000 yen, which is it's about $1,000 a month US, so that's about 7,700 rand, 8,000 rand per month per person, until a further review period coming out between March and May of this year. Home compensation is about 10 million per house plus 3 million per resident. All in all, that comes to about 130,000 US dollars for a house, and that would be about $30,000, $40,000 per resident. When you consider the total loss of goods, the size of the properties, and the real estate costs in Japan per se in some of these areas, they really do come short. Unemployment coverage and the gaps between private unemployment and public unemployment welfare are being looked at in scrutiny, because we're seeing that 72%, 70% of the people there in the Fukushima area affected by radiation are unemployed. Comparing just north in Ishinomaki, where there isn't radiation problems, the level is 38. That's still very high. The national average for unemployment in Japan is just under 5%. So that gives you some parameters for comparison. And when we put all of this, and still looking at the numbers, we say, okay, there's 200,000 displaced persons. Of those, 51% are in temporary housing. That's 100,000 people. And they're going to be in temporary housing. The government has agreed to pay for it for 3 years. We were in year 1, so we've got 2 years left. We've got 2 years left in the perspective of Japanese society to solve the issues of compensation for land, for assets, insurance, unemployment. And the initial figures are already pointing to 11, some of the estimates up to 15 billion in the gap shortcoming that the government is going to have to cover. That is taxpayer money. That is taxpayer money in a country which has been hit in other areas with a disaster. And the solution has been to have to look at a disaster recovery tax. The Japanese have nationally embraced that need and are for it, but it is a quite costly thing to consider. I've put a couple of other numbers there just in terms of the unemployment and the delinquency on loans, coming from a financial service background again. Of the families in the Fukushima zone, lots of them were farmers or fishermen, and they were heavily leveraged with the government under subsidy programs also for their goods. Most of these people are unable to pay their debts, and indeed of the 200,000 people that we see in the Fukushima area, almost 100%, I think it's 98%, are requiring assistance from family members or from the government. And the shortcomings are going to be most poignant now that unemployment insurance is running out in the next 2 to 3 months, 12 months after the calamity, usually that's kicking in. So that's just to leave you with a couple of things to chew on in terms of where facts and figures can come out of left field and make the issue of adopting nuclear energy perhaps more onerous. Nonetheless, one also has to keep in mind that the first responders, which I was speaking of earlier, have done an enormous and great job in Japan of overcoming these shortcomings now in their budget and their infrastructure and continuing to give service and help to the people who have been affected by that.